Have you ever noticed how patient we are when someone is learning to drive? We expect mistakes. We expect that the engine to stall. We even smile and say that, well, that's right. Try again. But when it comes to our own life, we often expect perfection far too early. What if life was never meant to be a performance? What if it was actually meant to be something closer to a driving lesson? A place where things feels a little bit jerky at first, where mistakes are part of the process, and where the real goal is learning.
I'm Hanna Zaxmy, your leadership coach, and this podcast is your confidence boost in color. Let's go.
Hi, and welcome back. I'm really glad you're here. Let me start with a simple question. Do you have a driving license? If you do, you probably remember what it was like when you were learning to drive. If you don't have, well, you probably at least have been sitting in the back seat while someone else is practicing. You know that slightly jerky feeling that the car moves, stops, and moves again. The clutch is released a little too quickly, and the engine stalls, and everyone inside the car becomes very aware that something new is happening. Learning to drive is rarely smooth in the beginning, but something interesting happens during that phase. You are completely present. You notice everything, the mirrors, the pedals, the sound of the engine, the other cars around you. You are curious because you know one thing. You are learning. Right now, I'm in a slightly more intense driving practice period again. This time, it isn't me learning to drive. It's my daughter. She has set a goal to get her license before the summer so she can easily travel to her summer job. It's a realistic goal, but it requires practice, a lot of practice. So I've been sitting in the passenger seat quite a bit lately, giving instructions, offering advice, and observing. The first sessions were on a quiet, empty area. No traffic, no spectators, just space to explore. She started learning how the car works, how the clutch and gear interacts, and when to brake, when to accelerate. And at the beginning, there was quite a few sudden stops, a few loud engine sounds, and many restarts. But slowly, little by little, things have started to flow more easily. At the beginning, everything is happening in your head. You understand what needs to happen, but translating in that understanding into movement, into coordination between hands and feet, well, it sometimes takes time. Your brain understands, your body is still catching up. But something fascinating happens with repetition. At first, every movement requires conscious thinking. Clutch, gear, gas. But after a while, the body starts learning too. And suddenly you notice something has shifted. A reflection I have been taking with me from these driving practice sessions is the importance of leaving the overthinking trap. Because becoming a good driver doesn't happen mainly through thinking about driving. It happens through practice. Theory matters, of course, like understanding the rules, the signals, the mechanisms of the car. All of that is, of course, helpful. But none of that truly settles into your body until you practice again and again. Until something shifts from thinking into movement, into instinct, into that quiet feeling of, I know what I'm doing. And I think this is something many of us recognize in life as well. It's easy to stay in our heads, to think about what we should do, to analyze, to plan, to replay the same thoughts again and again. But nothing actually changes until we start acting, until we begin to practice. Planning matters, yes. Reflection matters, of course. But I'm saying this just as much to myself as to anyone listening. I want to move a little faster from thinking mode into practice mode, to allow myself to build more muscle memory, to try, to adjust, and to try again, and simply practice. And then suddenly the practice starts paying off. Our driveway starts with a fairly steep hill, and it's actually easier to reverse up the hill when parking, which means that you have the control of the clutch, the gas, the steering, all at the same time. Not exactly the easiest task when you are learning. But recently, after successfully reversing up the hill and parking, my daughter turned to me with a big smile and said, "Now I can hear when the engine is at the right speed. I don't even need to look at the rev counter anymore." And in that moment, you could see it. Something had moved from thinking to more feeling. Watching these practice sessions made me reflect on something else as well. When I enter performance mode, I often become more tense, more focused on getting everything exactly right. And strangely enough, that's often when things become more jerky, more rigid, more effortful. My focus moves entirely into my head and everything becomes tighter. But when I shift into a learning mode, something changed. Instead of why did this go wrong, the question becomes interesting. What can I learn from this? What might I try differently next time? And that small shift changes a lot. So here's a thought. What if we saw life more like a long driving practice, not at a final exam, not a performance, but a continuous learning journey? This idea connects closely to the work of psychologist Carol Dweck, who introduced the concept of fixed mindset and growth mindset. In a fixed mindset, we tend to believe our abilities are fixed. We either succeed or fail. We either perform well or we don't. Mistakes becomes evidence that something is wrong. But in the growth mindset, mistakes becomes part of learning, just like when learning to drive. An engine stall isn't a failure, it's a feedback. It simply shows where your next bit of learning is. Something to practice, something to adjust. The interesting thing is that when we are learning something new, we expect it to be messy. We expect stalls. We expect awkward moments. But in work, in life, we often expect ourselves to perform perfectly much sooner. Imagine this scenario. You drive for 20 minutes. Everything goes smoothly. And then the engine stalls once when you pull onto that new road. What do you focus on? The 90 minutes that worked or the one moment that didn't? Many of us zoom in on that one particular moment. But through a growth mindset lens, that moment simply becomes information. Maybe next time you release the clutch a little slower, maybe you add a little more gas, you adjust, you practice, you learn. And you also celebrate the 19 other minutes that actually went well. One thing I've noticed when sitting next to my daughter is how curious she is about everything happening around the car. She listens, she observes, she experiments, and that curiosity makes the whole process lighter. It turns driving practice into exploration, even for me that is sitting beside her. And I think that is exactly what a growth mindset looks like. Curiosity instead of judgment, learning instead of proving, and practice instead of perfection. In work and in life, we often carry a lot of expectation to know the answers, to perform well, to move quickly. But what if life was also a practice drive? What if we allowed ourselves to say, I'm learning? What if every difficult conversation, every meeting, every decision was another opportunity to practice? That perspective doesn't lower standards. It's actually increasing learning, because when we are less afraid of mistakes, we experiment more, we notice more, we grow faster. So here's a reflection for you this week. Where in your life are you currently in a practice drive? Maybe it's at work, maybe it's at parenting, maybe building something new. And if you allowed yourself to approach that area with a growth mindset, what would change? What would you become curious about? What would you practice just a little bit more? Learning to drive takes time. It starts slowly, sometimes a bit jerky, but with practice, attention and curiosity, movement becomes smoother. Confidence grows, and one day you suddenly realize you're no longer just thinking about driving, you're simply driving. Maybe life is a bit like that too. A long practice drive, where the most important thing is not the speed, but the willingness to keep learning. This is what the growth mindset really looks like. Life is not a final exam, it's a practice drive. So release the clutch, try the next gear and move forward. Because confidence doesn't grow from thinking about the road, it grows from driving it. So if this episode resonated with you, feel free to share it with someone who might need the reminder that the learning is part of the journey. And don't forget to follow the podcast to not miss out on the next episode. And as always, be confident, be you.